Hello, everybody. This week I will not be able to make it to class. I'll be out of town on my job, something that just come up yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick lecture for chapter 37. And then, of course, we've got the term project due this weekend. And so really this gives you guys extra time to focus on your term project. And remember, next week is Thanksgiving week, so we'll have no class again. So to be counted absent, or sorry, to be counted present for this class, I will be asking a simple question sometime during this lecture. And if you would just send me a quick email saying, giving me the answer to the easy question, and then I'll count you present for the class. Obviously, in this class, we're going to quickly go over chapter 37. I'm sure some of us already did it. There was a discrepancy between the uh, McGraw Hill due date and the schedule. The class schedule said that it was due this coming Friday or this coming Saturday. And of course, with the McGraw Hill, it was saying that it was due last week. So, anyway, just super frustrating that there was a discrepancy there, but that has been rectified. I gave you guys until this Saturday to complete chapter 37. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. This is chapters called Business and the Environment. So obviously our learning objectives are going to be, let's see here, describe history of federal statutes dealing with environmental protection, explain how the federal government regulates itself in the area of environmental protection, describe how government regulates businesses in relation to the environment, discuss how major federal legislation aims to reduce pollution, describe theories of law under which private citizens may sue persons and businesses that harm the environment, identify several types of pollution that are of great concern to society, identify several factors that influence the changing global climate, and then finally identify other environmental issues for which there is a growing concern. So if you guys go back and look at American history, prior to the turn of the 20th century, which would be 1900s, primarily probably 85 plus percentage of Americans, their everyday job was in agriculture. There wasn't a lot of industry going. There wasn't a lot of mining for various ores. There was no really large factories producing pollutants and sending various chemicals and stuff into the air and into the environment. Then of course around the turn of the century, at least here in the southeast, we started having textile mills pop up on the rivers. Lots of the dyes that they were using to dye the various fabrics and stuff, where they were just letting go into the river. Of course, especially the Middle Tiger River and the Tiger River here in upstate South Carolina got heavily polluted from those dyes of those textile mills. And then, of course, industries up in the Northeast, putting smoke and smog all into the air, producing the various, automobiles and other industrial machinery and stuff, began polluting, obviously, our earth. And of course, we just were not really aware of those risks. And by 1960s, we were starting to see this. Early federal statutes addressing environmental issues, primarily of conservation of forest and wildlife. So we were aware of that. Like, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president in 1904, something like that, the early 19 teens or whatever, he was actually the president that started, kind of designating certain parts of the country as federal wildlife conservation lands, which could not be touched. No residential living, no industrial machinery, and of course, no chopping down of the trees for at that time that made homes and buildings and various other goods and stuff. Of course, he was a big hunter and loved wildlife. And at that time, we were growing, from coast to coast. Population was accelerating, and we wanted to, kind of circle out some places within the U.S. that was going to stay wild. Of course, here in upstate South Carolina, just right across the border over western North Carolina, northern Georgia, and East Tennessee, we've got quite a few national forests. Where I live here in Oconee County, I could throw a rock and hit a handful of the national forests. I think Sumter National Forest is very close to us, and quite a few others as well. Obviously, that's a good thing, right? But in 1960s, United States citizens began to insist strict environmental laws be enacted to maintain purity of air and water. I'm sure we've all heard of Earth Day. Earth Day inaugural was 1970. Operations of businesses, firms had major effect on the environment, as we just kind of put out. We go by plants every day. Has anybody ever ridden by a paper plant? That is one awful smell. But we see smoke rising in the air and coal plants and this and that. All of these things, we end up ingesting or inhaling one way or another. I'm actually from the state of Indiana as a young man, and that state is full of agriculture. And I just read an article the other day about how cancer rates in agricultural states are above the national average, and that's because of all of the herbicide or all the pesticides and stuff that they're spraying have been spraying on the vegetation and the crops there generation after generation. Obviously that stuff goes into the ground. Rainwater washes into the river. The deers, the rabbit, they eat the foliage. They then get the contaminants. And of course, when we ingest the deer or we ingest the corn, we also digest those contaminants. Policymakers find it problematic to balance importance of allowing business production at optimal levels while maintaining environmental protection. That is a big they're really still looking for synergy here, right? If you limit production, you limit the ability for people to make money and to work. But if we let that just run wild, we end up polluting our local areas and, of course, the country as a whole. Moving on, government self-regulation. The National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA. Remember, we talked about administrative law. Keep going back to that. Federal law required any public project, dam, stadium, canal, highway, etc., using federal funds to have an approved environmental impact statement, also known as an EIS, prior to the commencement of work. Council on Environmental Quality issues guidelines for EIPs. So if you're a private company, because the government hires private companies to build dams, to build highways and canals and stadiums and all of those things. But within those, you have to have this EIS statement before you can even begin work, basically saying this is how the project is going to go. This is how we're going to do cleanup. This is how we're going to ensure that no contaminants or pollutants are a result or a byproduct of our work. To be approved, an EIS statement must provide responses to questions such as, what is the environmental impact of proposed project? What negative environmental effects will result from the proposed project? What are alternatives to the proposed project, including taking no action? What short-term and long-term harm of environmental resources will result from the proposed project? And then finally, what irreversible or irretrievable commitments of resources will be consumed by proposed project? So you can imagine a stadium being built in downtown Greenville or something, or a new interstate being built in Greenville County somewhere. The amount of engineers and scientists have to go in that work with alongside these companies to create these EIS statements must be a lot of money and a lot of time. I've told you guys many times, I've got a buddy of mine who runs a company called Life and Safety that works with OSHA compliance. I also know of a company in Charleston that I've gotten kind of close with the owner. They kind of help make sure people that are EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the big dog when it comes to the oversight of manufacturing and industrial work in America to ensure the environment's kept safe. They help companies make sure that the EPA compliant. So you can imagine the construction company that's building the new interstate, they hire a handful of engineers, civil engineers, and scientists to ensure that everything they're doing is going to be compliant to EPA standards, help them produce the EIS statement, and then they may even hire that EPA consulting company to come in and double check and make sure that they're not missing anything. The type of fines, the type of things the government can, levy on you are severe. When it comes to the environment, it's like protection of classes. It's a big thing in America, and rightly so, right? Every human being, I don't care who you are, how you describe yourself, or how you identify, you got a right to live and breathe and work in this country. And same thing goes for our environment. That's important. We don't need to go down that road. I'm sure we all are kind of, in agreement with that. Here we are, the big EPA. This goes back to administrative law, folks, created in 1970. I know for a lot of you young folks, that must seem like an eon ago, but I'm here to tell you that's less than a lifetime ago. And to think that less than a lifetime ago, we didn't have a body such as the EPA is kind of scary. Go back and look at some of the Northeast cities like Detroit and some of these other kind of industrial cities of the 1960s. And excuse me, I got to sneeze here. I'm trying to resist the urge to sneeze. All right. You could just see the smog floating through the air, right? London, England, with all the coal and stuff every winter. Man, it was gross. But anyway, created in 1970, this federal agency has responsibility for regulating business activities impacting the environment. The EPA conducts environmental research, assists states and municipalities with grants and technical advice. Again, municipalities are just cities or towns. Administers the federal pollution laws that cover businesses. So you can imagine the EPA is made up of engineers and various scientists to ensure, because they're the folks that understand this world. They're the ones that create the laws surrounding pollution, for various industries and businesses. Sets environmental standards and regulations. Major federal legislation protecting the environment. We're going to go through each of these. We've got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, also known as the Superfund. If any of you are politically savvy or follow politics, you've probably heard the term Superfund many times in your life. Under the entire umbrella of NEPA, and I'm not going to read all of these, but you can kind of see all of these different bodies and that lie up under NEPA, which are quite a few. We're going to talk about the first handful here. The Clean Air Act of 1970 was created with recognition of fact air pollution sometimes crosses boundary lines of local jurisdictions and extends into 2 or more states. Probably the biggest example of this didn't happen in the U.S. It was called Chernobyl, which happened in the Ukraine, and they had a meltdown. And somewhere in like Scandinavia, maybe Norway or Sweden, a couple of days later, they see cows just dropping dead in a pasture. And the world was then made aware of a major catastrophe within Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Some of you may have heard of that. The law emphasized in protecting the environment. State regulation is insufficient and federal law is needed. So this is kind of where you see the federal government being big brother, if you will. That's kind of a term. It's not meant to be masculine or feminine. It's known as that as big brother. And this is it kind of keeping an eye on the state, and where the state's not quite as stringent or as rigorous as the federal law here. So the federal law umbrellas this and oversees this. On international level, treaties among countries provide environmental protection. That goes back to that Chernobyl example in the country of Ukraine, which it was a Russian nuclear power plant in Ukraine. At the time, Ukraine was part of the USSR. Don't want to get into too much detail of that, but it affected a lot of countries that were outside of the borders of Ukraine and Russia. All states are required to develop air quality standards at least as rigorous as federal standards. Such standards include primary standards serve to protect human life and health. That is the number one standard you've got to follow. You've got to provide, you've got to protect human life and health of humanity. Secondary standards serve to protect property, vegetation, climate, and aesthetic values. The Clean Air Act covers 2 other forms of pollution. Stationary pollution caused by factories and other production facilities, and mobile pollution caused by automobiles, trains, airplanes, etc. Why do you think we're having such a drive towards electric cars? We're trying to get rid of mobile pollution and automobiles in this country. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, but the U.S. is a automobile country. Very few cities in America really operate without automobiles, even our large cities. New York would be the best example of a city that works on mass transit. Everybody rides the subway. There's other various ways of taking, transit without getting into your vehicle. But you go to the second largest city in America, LA, and it is automobile centered. You have to have an automobile to live in LA. You can't live in the city of Greenville without a vehicle. You're not going to get to your job. You're not going to get to the bank. You're not going to get to mom's house on Thanksgiving, right? We all spend our time stuck on 85, stuck on Woodruff Road, stuck on 385, commuting the byways and highways of Greenville County. Several amendments have been made to the Clean Air Act, or amendments to the Clean Air Act require emissions from automobiles contain fewer pollutants. Every year, every new generation of vehicles, we see lower emissions, higher safety standards. Gasoline sold in the United States also must be cleaner. Factories install new technologies to reduce discharge of pollutants into the air. Big automobile companies like Toyota and BMW, they love to brag about low emissions and safety and all of these things. This is This is capitalism doing its job, if you will. It's not only their buyers demanding safer cars, cleaner cars, but they're also, of course, getting push and force from the governments within they operate. Germany certainly has large or a lot of environmental laws, and of course that's where BMW comes from. Toyota in Japan, they certainly have a lot of environmental protection laws, and of course here in the U.S., which we're discussing here today, has more than enough, right? All right, the Clean Water Act, which when you think about air, what's next? Water. I mean, without water, life is impossible. And kind of giving a science lesson to my daughter over the weekend, we kind of went through that. The importance without water, life of any kind would be impossible. The Clean Air Act of 1972 sets minimum standards for water purity similar to the Clean Air Act. Included in such standards is fishable and swimmable. So when you think about swimmable and fishable, you're going to eat out of the water, you're going to catch a fish. Is it safe to eat? Am I safe to dive on in? I don't know about you guys, but I don't dive in things I can't see the bottom. Never been a fan of that. My mother will go down to the beach and she'll literally swim out where you can't see her, floating around out there. And I have literally popped a vein in my forehead yelling at her for that, but she will just keep going. And I'm a guy that thinks if I can't see the bottom, something's trying to get me, and I just don't do that. An intermediate standard of water quality allowing navigable waterways to be used for propagation of fish, like propagation of fish. There's a lot of fish farms, believe it or not, especially up in the Northwest with salmon and various other things. Propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and of course, recreational purposes. Ultimate goal of Clean Air Act is to eliminate discharge of pollutants into nation's waters. So when you think going back to that textile example, we don't have textiles mills no longer along the rivers here in the Southeast. But when I was a kid here in upstate South Carolina, all the mills were still up and running. I mean, every night when I lived in Startex as a kid, you could hear and see the steam rising off that mill. And of course, all the dye and the use, I guess the byproducts of those dyes and stuff that were dyeing the fabrics, man, they just jettisoned into the river. And then, of course, 100 yards down from there, people are swimming and fishing. Of course, today that's no longer allowed, and it's safe to swim in the river and, of course, eat the fish and stuff that come out of it. Example of the Clean Water Act: an offshore oil drilling rig owned by BP and operating in the Gulf of Mexico exploded. This was, I think, about a decade ago. Partially drilled well began spewing and up to an estimated 60,000 barrels of oil per day. Folks, that is unbelievable. In fact, BP is a British company, a UK company, British Petroleum. They had to pay, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars, not only for cleanup, but they also had to reimburse the fishing industry of the Gulf of Mexico was absolutely gutted. Like, you can't fish this. You can't catch this fish and then try to sell it at the market because nobody's going to want it. So that was a big issue about a decade ago. After several months, BP was successful in efforts to permanently cap the well. However, the leak resulted in a massive oil slick that substantially damaged coastal areas and marine life. BP was found to be in violation of the Clean Water Act and was subject to civil and criminal fines. And you can bet they enumerated them. All right, the Superfund of 1980. Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CRCLA. More popularly referred to as Superfund, as I was saying at the beginning of the lecture. If some of you folks are involved in politics, you've probably heard this thrown around a few times. Law regulates dumping of waste into land. Superfund designates specific sites, placing them on national priorities lists, and mandates these locations be cleaned by owners. EPA, again, the Environmental Protection Agency, has authority to conduct cleanups when immediate action must be taken, enforce penalties against potentially responsible parties, ensure community involvement, involve states, ensure long-term protectiveness. Superfund created a hazardous substance trust fund to help defray costs in cleaning environmental scarred land. Get into it a little bit more here. Example: federal legislation protecting environment. Hubbell Coal Company went bankrupt in 1977. Hubbell owned 10,000 acres of environmentally damaged land and had numerous creditors who had not been paid. The land was designated as a Superfund site, a for-profit company called New Source received federal grant to purchase the land, but was required to engage in a massive cleanup before reclaiming land for use as a park and wildlife preserve. Therefore, New Source was justified in conducting the cleanup under authority established by the EPA. And the super fun thing, I've seen a lot of examples of this. Man, this is a good kind of smart government here to take some of these lands, like a Hubble Coal Company that used to be there, and then they went bankrupt, and the land got and the facility got seized, and then of course this nonprofit came in, got a grant, which was paid for, and they cleaned it up, and of course now this land can be fished, swimmed, camped, and everything else, and it's safe for wildlife. Lawsuits by private citizens. In event a business firm creates pollution or damages the environment, in event a business firm creates pollution or damages the environment, in addition to being required to pay a fine, it may be held liable to private persons. Types of lawsuits by private citizens, back to that tort laws, folks: negligence, nuisance, and trespass. An example here: Stefan owned a workshop adjacent to a small manufacturing company owned by Melvin. Melvin's company continually placed numerous bags of unprotected trash near the property line. Stefan observed presence of vermin, which would be like rats and so on his property, and wrote Melvin a letter requesting removal of the trash. That is, abate the private nuisance. If Melvin refuses to solve the problem, Stefan may hire a company to remove the trash and claim reimbursement from Melvin, or get a court order from Melvin to remove the trash. Ultimately, Melvin's going to remove this trash, right? They'll bring the long arm down, or the law down on you for something like that, and you're not beating. It's impossible. So, all right, lawsuits by private citizens, and this happens a lot, folks. Think about the Flint, Michigan, with the water that they were drinking several years ago. I can still remember Barack Obama, when he was president, he went to Flint, Michigan to say, "Hey, this water is clean," and he had a glass of it, and the sip that he took did not look like he really wanted to guzzle that water, but he kind of just sipped it. But anyway, it's kind of a funny anecdote there. Negligence, tort allowing the plaintiff to bring a lawsuit against a defendant under state law for causing personal injury or property damage. Businesses that create pollution frequently cause injury to people or damage to their property, and these businesses may be found liable by a court for negligence. Give you an example: my grandfather died of colon cancer, and many other people in his plant died of cancer as well, because the plant that he was working in was just polluting the entire area. In fact, there was a neighborhood adjacent to the plant, and the people in that cul-de-sac also developed cancer. And of course, what did they do? They all, under the tort of negligence, and file a lawsuit, and all of them win a pretty good large sum of money. Most states have laws prohibiting creation of a nuisance, a condition that affects a person's or community's health, causes property damage, or interferes with well-being. And you also don't want, like if you're trying to sell a house or you own land somewhere, the last thing you want is some factory being built next to it where pollutants are even possible. That's like buying land next to an airport. I mean, land is the only thing that doesn't depreciate, but it's not going to appreciate in that position either. You don't. Last place you want to be is next to a factory or an airport, right? Two categories of nuisances are private nuisance impacts public property, public nuisance impacts public property, and of course, private nuisance impacts private property. That'd be like our homes. Public property would be like the park or something of that nature. Lawsuits by private citizens: trespass, unauthorized entry onto another person's property. Businesses that cause pollution are in effect sending pollutants onto another person's land or water. If I own land somewhere and the factory 10 miles away, all of its, I guess, all of its pollutants and smog or something settle on my land, that's going to be a problem, right? Most states recognize a cause of action for particle trespass. Remember that term, particle trespass. Theory that businesses are trespassing on another person's property with their pollution particles. Types of pollution, there's a lot of them, folks. Noise pollution, pesticide control, solid waste disposal, toxic substance disposal, and of course, natural resource conservation and acid rain. If you're a child of the 80s, which none of you are, and I am, acid rain was like a big time buzzword, right? I mean, it was like everybody talked about acid rain from all the, and I remember like aerosol cans and stuff were considered, it's eating a hole in the ozone layer, blah, blah, blah. Most widely identified forms of pollution are those impacting air, water, and land. Other pollution and environmental issues are of great concern to society and subject to federal laws. And of course, here the examples are again. taking a 20-second break here. Your question to be counted present in this class is simply email me what's your favorite color. Okay, you can just say blue, pink, yellow, whatever combination, and then I will count you present for this class. All right, moving on here. Noise pollution. Exposure to loud noise for extended periods of time may affect an individual's ability to hear, cause mood swings, and alleged to cause injury to fetus and wildlife, believe it or not. When I was younger, I knew a guy named Joe who worked in a big factory, and we were running machines on the floors when I was a young man. And I'd always go over to him and I'd have to yell for him, and he would never be able to hear me. I'd have to tap on his shoulder or something. He was always wearing earplugs. And he said for 30 years he worked without them and lost like 25% of his hearing. So he now is doing his best to protect his hearing, right? But even living next to a facility that they're making loud bangs, loud noises, that's going to affect your, not only you, but everything in that surrounding area, right? Pesticide control, something we don't have a lot of issue here in the upstate because we don't have a lot of agriculture. But in like my home state of Indiana, this is a big deal. Continued use of pesticide often causes insects to become immune to chemical compounds, resulting in the pesticide becoming ineffective. Of course, what do? They use stronger and stronger pesticides that have to be created to control this insect population, so their yield of corn or soybean or whatever, stays consistent. Individuals and wildlife may become ill or damaged by pesticides. And earlier, I made that example back in Indiana, how the pesticides not only get into the food that we ingest, but the animals ingest it. It runs when it rains, it runs into the streams, creeks, rivers, ponds, and then of course that kind of a tangled web it weaves, right? Many individuals are not comfortable with having food grown in environments wherein pesticides are used. Like for example, like we like the Ingles brand that's Harvest is a organic brand that's done up in Western North Carolina. No pesticides are used, and a lot of people are driving that change in the way grocery stores operate. Used to they'd buy their chicken from California, fill it full of preservatives, freeze it, send it this way on a truck. We get here 6 weeks later, we're eating it. It's the market's getting kind of shrinking. It's getting more and more local, so they don't have to use preservatives, don't have to freeze it, don't have to use pesticides or whatever else, right? All right, types of pollution, solid waste disposal. Many municipalities require businesses and homeowners recycle paper, plastic, glass, and metal products. Inside the city of Greenville, there's a big effort with that. If any of you live within the city limits, many companies are going green. That is making products and packaging them environmentally friendly ways. This became kind of a big term in your guys' lifetime. So in the last 10 years, green initiatives, this is a big buzzword as well. Toxic substance disposal, quantity of waste materials that can cause great harm to humans or wildlife who are exposed to them. Toxic substances include medical waste and chemicals. Medical waste is a serious issue, and obviously chemical waste in some of these plants is a very big issue, right? Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, RCRA, governs storage and disposal of toxic substances. Under RCRA, EPA has authority to regulate facilities that generate, transport, treat, store, or dispose of hazardous waste. So that procedure of generating it, creating the problem, transporting it, moving it from A to B, how you treat it to make it stable enough, how you store it, of course, and how you dispose of it. Types of pollution here: natural resource conservation. Natural resource conservation, sorry. The United States has extraordinary forests and wetlands of great aesthetic, environmental, and economic value. Of course, in this country, we've got, almost like we've got deserts, we've got snow-peaked mountains, we've got tropical, we've got subtropical, we have this, we have that, right? Policymakers struggle with designing laws and regulations protecting these resources without disturbing natural ecological order. Acid rain, sulfur emissions created primarily by manufacturing of plants located in the central U.S. Now, this is where we see a lot of manufacturing in the last 25, 30 years moving to the Southeast, but the Midwest, Detroit, Indiana, Ohio, places like this, these were like the big manufacturing states in the country for the last 70 years. So again, sulfur emissions created primarily by manufacturing plants located in central U.S. cause pollutants discharged into the atmosphere, result in so-called acid rain. Acid rain creates damage to forest, crops, kills fish, it destroys paint, finishes on automobiles and buildings. And of course, what's scary about acid rain is, well, it goes with the, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze here. I'm trying not to sneeze, guys. So anyway, so it gets into the jet stream, into the storm. Of course, the clouds move 100 miles away, drops rain, and that acid rain from that plant is now affecting people hundreds of miles away. Right, that can be a serious issue. And I'm going to sneeze. All right, changing global environment, greenhouse effect. If any of you know anything about greenhouse effect or anything about our fellow planets in our solar system, Venus is known as like the greenhouse effect gone mad. It's the hottest planet in the solar system. Believe it or not, Mercury is the first closest planet to the sun, but Venus is way hotter than that. And that's because its atmosphere is so thick, heat from the sun is not able to escape. And essentially, that's kind of in a small way could be happening here on our planet. Scientists believe increased burning of fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil, has loaded the atmosphere with heat trapping, as I just said, carbon dioxide, CO2. So that means one atom of carbon and two atoms of oxygen make the molecule CO2, created global warming, a condition known as the greenhouse effect. Resulting rising temperatures can melt the polar ice caps, causing rising sea levels throughout the world. And I know for all you young folks, this has been, part of your vernacular throughout your whole life. You've heard about these serious issues. All right, changing global environment, destruction of the rain and forest. Growing recognition economic interests are causing gradual destruction of world's rainforest and tropical climates. What are the big ones down in the Amazon, right? Down in Brazil, places like that. We're really worried about it. What do trees do with photosynthesis? I think they take carbon monoxide out of the air and produce oxygen back or something of that nature. And this is a serious issue. Deforestation alters distribution and circulation of water, which may lead to drought, flooding, soil erosion, changes in wind and ocean currents, and in rainfall. Another serious result of deforestation is absorption of carbon dioxide from atmosphere is reduced, as I just said. So the trees absorb carbon dioxide and then push out oxygen, I believe, and that's called photosynthesis. This is a critical part of life on Earth, right? All right, getting close here, folks. Changing global environment, destruction of the ozone layer. I kind of touched on this in a minute ago. Release of chlorofluorocarbons into the air has damaged ozone layer in the atmosphere. The hole in the ozone layer is most manifest over the South Pole, causing concern over its potential impact on Earth health. Because the ozone layer protects the environment from ultraviolet rays of the sun, damaging this shield could lead to major problems for humans, agricultural products, forests, and wildlife. And you guys can feel free to watch that video if you like. I know that the department had put that in there. I'm not requiring it, but feel free to check that out. I'm sure all of us probably heard a little bit about the ozone layer and the hole in it. But this was kind of big news in the 80s when this was kind of first discovered. From my understanding, though, I don't think that the hole has increased very much. So the cause could be a little gray area, but I don't want to speak out of my tail end. I could be wrong, but I kind of recollect hearing something about that. The whole global warming debate is very heated, right? One side seems totally convinced, the other side's convinced the other way, and it seems so politically driven that it's hard for folks like you and I to really say who do we believe, right? When it's so partisan politics. And I remember when Al Gore, who was the vice president of Bill Clinton, I believe he's the one that created that video, that first kind of big documentary on global warming, and it made some ridiculous predictions that all turned out to be wrong. So a lot of doubt has been put into it. And I remember telling somebody back when he ran and kind of, put that video out, like he was going to solve it. And a buddy of mine said, man, this is scary. And I said, Al Gore sure hopes he scares everybody because he's going to get their vote. But I think it muddied the waters of the science because as soon as a politician got behind that cause, it politicized it. And it should have come from the science community, not government. That's just my opinion. Other environmental issues, biodiversity of concern to environmentalists is notion that thousands of species are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. It is estimated since year 1600, approximately 260 animal species, 270 insect species, and 380 vascular plants have become extinct. Ocean pollution is a serious. I'm sure you guys have all heard about plastic in the ocean. A developing problem is ocean dumping, in which waste materials illegally deposited into waters far off coastal areas. Most of the countries do this are India and China. You know, they're where the most plants lie. They lie on rivers, where the rivers run, ocean, right? All these rivers get polluted, contaminated, goes into the ocean, so on and so forth. Ocean dumping is allowed under limited circumstances. EPA is charged with responsibility of selecting appropriate sites and types of waste that may be discarded into oceans by U.S. organizations. Where is the most coming from? I think he's going to answer that the next slide, but I gave you an example there. I just saw this the other day. We had like millions and millions and millions of tires, you know, that are no longer usable, that are just people are stacking up in junkyards. Somebody got the brainiac idea of tying them all together and making a natural coral reef out of them. Well, needless to say, you guys can look this up. It was a calamity to say the least. After a long time, all the stuff that made up these tires that starts contaminating the water, it didn't make a reef. And just an example of something that was allowed to happen was still a huge error. And it seems this would happen in the 80s. Like, how could this have happened? How could you guys so recently made such an asinine mistake? But it happened. All right, closing down here, folks. Space pollution. Just seen Elon Musk talking about this the other day, that this has been blown up more than what it really is, but for the sake of conversation, we'll go through it. Environmentalists have recently turned attention to increased amount of space junk orbiting the Earth. Satellites no longer in use or in disrepair continue to orbit Earth. A lot of those satellites are known what's dying orbits. So after a while, they'll start falling back to Earth, and most of them are in a way that they'll be burned up in atmosphere or drop into the ocean. Right? It is estimated that there are 10,000 of these satellites in orbit. In 2008, a Navy missile scored a direct hit on the fuel tank of a dying spy satellite orbiting 130 miles over the Pacific Ocean, eliminating a toxic threat to people on Earth. Other environmental stuff is overpopulation or underpopulation. Like China is in a big problem. Like they don't like to keep production. They don't have their birth rates are too low. If any of you follow Elon Musk, he's always telling people to have more kids. And then you've got kind of the Bill Maher side always saying, don't have kids. It's overpopulated. But again, this is one of those us and them discussions that, the true answer hasn't been fleshed out. We don't have to have that argument here, though. World's population continues to grow for now. Current world population of approximately 7 billion is 7 times that of 200 years ago and estimated to rise to 15 million by 2100. Or not. Many estimates currently say that population will top out between 10 and 11 million before 2100, and then will begin to steady decline. This is already a major concern in nearly all developed countries. If you guys are interested in this, I would suggest following this Pew Research link here, because that is actually an issue. And excuse me, man, I'm trying to sneeze. Elon Musk is always talking about this. But anyway, increased population has major negative impacts on environment and resources. But if people are our greatest asset, then, so let that kind of think about. I know that's a big kind of topic for the department head. So anyway, folks, that's chapter 37. Again, I apologize about not being able to meet you guys on Tuesday, but we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. Remember, next week is Thanksgiving, so I hope every one of you have a fantastic holiday, and safe holiday, that is. If you have any questions about the term project, please let me know. I'm going to upload this video to my YouTube channel and then share that with all of you folks. You can watch it anytime in the week that you want. You don't have to watch it by Tuesday and send me an email Tuesday night. As long as you get to me by the Saturday night at grading time, I'll count you present for the class. That being said, I wish all of you a great week. And again, have a happy holiday.